Hi, I'm Michelle Higelin. I'm the Executive Director of ActionAid Australia. We're part of a global federation working in 45 countries around the world to advance women's rights and end poverty and injustice. Responding to the impacts of climate change on women and supporting women to take leadership in advancing climate justice are central to our work around the world, alongside working for women's economic justice and their rights in emergencies. So we're thrilled to be part of the Women of the World Festival today and to bring you directly the voices of some of the inspiring women we're working with around the world. Over this next 30 minutes, you'll hear about how climate change is impacting on their lives and how women are taking leadership to respond to these harmful impacts. You'll also hear about what we can do here in Australia and what we are already doing through ActionAid and our community of activists around the country to respond to climate change. So stay tuned and we hope you'll enjoy this next segment. Women are disproportionately impacted by climate change. ActionAid sees this in every country around the world where we work. As the impacts of climate change are felt, we see poverty and inequality deepen. We also see an increase in rates of violence against women and very harmful impacts on the food security of families, which we know is the responsibility of women in communities. Yet we also see from our work around the world that women play a critical role in responding to the impacts of climate change, a role that often goes under-recognised, under-resourced and undervalued. So we believe it's critical that we do invest in local women's leadership and we support women to build resilience over the longer term to climate change. We've been working in Vanuatu for the last 5 years to mobilise women to respond to the impacts of climate change and disasters on their lives. And the results are tremendous. You know, women have gone from being passive recipients of aid to actually driving solutions in their communities and interacting with formal decision-making processes through the Women Talk Together forum, which means women talk together. Because when women talk together, we know that they come up with solutions, and we know when women are resourced, they can also drive effective responses. And that's also been part of our work under the Shifting the Power Coalition in the broader Pacific region, where we're working with 13 women-led civil society organisations to support women's leadership in responding to climate change and disasters. We're working to build evidence about the impact of women's leadership. We're also working to advocate for greater inclusion of gender in climate change plans and disaster management plans in the region and also at national level. And we're also building women's skills and capabilities so they can interact in the formal spaces, bringing their localised knowledge, their wealth of experience, and their large community networks to drive change. Here's more about the Shifting the Power Coalition.
pursuit of women's rights and gender equality is really about, if you want for a better word, balancing the scales. And in the mission of the Shifting the Power Coalition, it really is about addressing the power structures and shifting the power so that there is equality.
We talk to our women in the community. They can spell out to us the changes that they have seen, and they are already informed by why these changes are happening to them and why climate change is for real.
We are living with climate change. We are affected by climate change.
So the Shifting the Power Coalition right now is strategically situated because it brings together partners from a number of Pacific Island countries, together with ActionAid Australia and women disability rights activists.
One thing that we must not forget is that whenever there are negotiations going on in terms of climate change, whether it'll be local negotiations, national, regional negotiations, there has to be spaces where women and young girls and vulnerable groups have to participate in all policy dialogues to do with climate change and disaster management.
But women has that proactive approach, I feel, that they have an understanding that there is a need for preparedness, there is a need to respond.
Gone are the days that we work in silos. Once we are working together, our issue becomes stronger.
As women, we don't need to be taught to protect everyone. It's instinctively, we are born with it. It's our nature, you know. So take into consideration safety of everyone, not just you know, their family, but also the community, you know, the society as a whole. And no one leave behind. They will let no one leave behind.
Seen behind the back of men, I want them to stand in front. Not taking power, but balancing the power in decision making. Women already have the knowledge in preparing for disaster, but they just don't know they are doing it. We can make a change. We can make a change, yes.
Our climate movement in Australia is very much focused on domestic emissions, but ActionAid's research is showing that we need to be keeping an eye on what Australian fossil fuel companies are doing overseas and what impact that has on women's rights and our climate. So for 2 years, we've tracked the carbon footprint of Australian stock exchange listed coal, oil and gas companies operating in low-income countries, and what we're seeing is an increase of up to 13% in potential emissions from 2017 to 2018. And to give you a sense of what that actually means, that 13% is equivalent to 5 times Australia's annual greenhouse gas emissions. And all of this is occurring against a backdrop where we really need to see urgent climate action, not just in Australia, because climate change is a global problem, but around the world. And in order to do that, we need to be holding Australian companies accountable so that they do their part. Our research has also found that Australian corporations are having a devastating impact on women's rights. So in one community in South Africa where ActionAid works, there are 15 mines, yet there are high levels of poverty, and we are seeing girls dropping out of school to join the sex trade with significant impacts on health and livelihoods. So we're seeing pollution, contaminated water and damage to housing. So the arguments that companies are making in terms of the economic benefit they're bringing to communities just aren't stacking up with the evidence. And so for those of us who really care about the environment, women's rights and justice, we need to be monitoring the overseas impacts of Australian corporations, as right now they're operating with very little scrutiny and their operations are making a huge contribution to our global carbon emissions. ActionAid's working directly with women leaders from communities impacted by mining in South Africa to document the impacts of mining on them. So things such as increases in violence and harassment, cracks in housing and polluted water sources, so we can expose the irresponsible conduct of Australian companies overseas. And using this evidence, as well as putting women's rights and demands at the forefront, ActionAid campaigns with our growing community of activists around the country to hold companies accountable to the impacts and to support these women to seek redress. And that's included engaging with Australian companies Resource Generation and South32, both of which are fossil fuel companies, and they've operated and have operated in South Africa. And the evidence has been powerful in forcing companies to come to the table and talk to affected communities. It's also enabled us to block public financing of harmful projects, and through this, we've elevated the voices of women at the forefront of these impacts and continued to help build the case for change.
What I will say to Australians is that here in South Africa, we are paying these costs of the mining companies. They are killing us. So they must just stop the funding, then we live in peace. I didn't choose to be an activist, but the situation forced me to do this kind of a job. Can you imagine staying next to the mine? It's not even 500 meters away from you. They keep on saying they are bringing development around South Africa, but we have to bear the brunt of mortality, fatality, skin rash on our private parts. When we talk about these issues, they are saying we are just lying. As we are poor now, we'll become more poor, the richer will become more richer. I'm also from the mining affected area, which is Carolina. It's found between Swaziland border and Johannesburg Road. We have to walk for long distance to fetch water, and the water was not clean for us, for our human beings, and we used that water to water our gardens, and you could see our food was dying. At the end of the day, we as women, we had to face all those consequences. You are forced to sleep with the mine bosses to get a job. You are forced to get diseases by the name of mining. I see these consequences almost every day in my daily life. I've decided to be a community monitor, to stand for my community, to raise the voice for the voiceless women who are scared to talk about this situation. Then we started to mobilize around South Africa, across South Africa where there's mine. We started to do awareness trainings to make everyone to be aware. I see more power, I see there's change, so I'm happy that I can stand up. I've experienced pain, but the pain keeps me going because I see more young people, they are able to voice out, even if I die doing this job, because I'm so passionate. We are saying as women, we need to talk about this such situation, document, do protest, do picketing. That's the only way we are fighting back. We say no to mining.
Climate change is a global problem that requires global solutions. COVID-19 is also a global problem that requires global solidarity and global solutions, and we need cooperation and partnership in a similar kind of way. COVID-19 also, I mean, it's easy to think about it as the health impact, but it's so much more than that, right? We're talking about countries facing economic collapse potentially if we're not able to get the economy going again anytime soon. It's exacerbating existing inequalities. Among the higher risk populations, we can see that there is a higher percentage of poor communities or minorities who are impacted by this as well. So there is an inequality dimension here. We're seeing that from an economic standpoint, workers and laborers are hit much harder than some professionals are. So there is this exacerbation of existing inequalities, and we're also seeing a focus in the conversation around recovery on corporations. And often there's a lot more emphasis on money to big corporations as opposed to individual workers and their rights. And really, for climate change, it's a similar kind of story, right? When we look at climate impacts, we see how climate impacts tend to impact poor and marginalized communities more. We tend to see how climate change exacerbates existing inequalities in our societies even more. And we tend to see massive corporate interests and special interests being at the center of inertia in addressing the problem. So in that sense, we are looking at it from that lens of where can we work on trying to fix these structural and systemic problems that are at the heart of the way in which both climate change and COVID-19 are playing out, both within our countries, but also across the globe. There are things that are unique about climate change that pose unique challenges, but in many contexts, on top of those things, what climate change does is it amplifies existing problems and accelerates them. So where you might have seen a little bit of variability in rainfall through a growing season, climate change will come in and change that variability to extremes, where you'll see 6 months of rain take place in 1 month, causing flooding, and then 8 months of no rain, causing drought. So especially for communities, countries that have agriculture as the staple for their economy and where most people are working, whether it's informal work or formal work, that hits hard, right? COVID is similar in that you have existing inequalities in society. You've got a broken healthcare system, or maybe a healthcare system that isn't working so well. COVID-19 hits and it throws everything into sharp focus. All of those inequalities, all of those problems are just front and center, and people die, right? In both of these situations, you've got a potential massive death toll on your hands when they hit. So, and the experience that we have in dealing with the climate crisis is that it's hitting poor developing countries much harder than others. And some of that is just by virtue of geographic location, but a lot of that is to do with their existing status, right? If you don't have a lot of space in your economy to deal with shocks, then the impact is just going to be that much worse for you. If you can't come back from a storm, if you can't, if you don't have the resources to get water to people during a drought, it's a cascading impact. So that's why we tend to focus a lot on resilience and livelihoods in the context of climate justice, and with women as a focus. And we also talk about how developed countries like the US and Australia need to be leading the charge on climate action, not only in terms of taking measures to reduce their emissions, but providing finance. And I raise this because one of the key things that we are talking about in the context of that sort of developed country to developing country justice element is that we really need to be providing debt relief to developing countries who are at the forefront of dealing with COVID-19. There are some countries in the sort of spectrum of lower income countries where between a quarter and half of their entire economy is taken up with servicing debt. And when you're dealing with that, like think about it on a personal level. If you've got a mortgage and a student loan that's taking up 50% of your paycheck, and then the rest of it has to go to food, which you absolutely need to survive, you don't have a lot of space to deal with a healthcare crisis on your hands, right? So I'm simplifying it, but that's sort of, in very simple terms, what these economies are challenged with. There's no fiscal space for them to deal with this crisis. So not only do we need injections of money to deal with COVID-19, that is on top of climate, right? Because climate impacts don't go away. They still need finance to deal with climate impacts, but they need money on top of that to deal with the healthcare crisis and economic crisis they're facing. But also we really need to be having an honest conversation about debt relief, because simply suspending payments just delays the problem further. But the one that's most relevant, I think, for this conversation is an ask around a regenerative economy, which I think you can also talk about as a caring economy. And at the center of that is this sort of all these things that I think we've been talking about, that we need to put people first. We need to put the planet alongside that, right? And we have to craft an economy that works for people and the planet.
In 2015, a Category 5 cyclone hit Vanuatu, devastating and impacting more than half the population. At the time, it was the worst natural disaster that the South Pacific had ever seen. When ActionAid met with women post-Cyclone Pam, they told us how they had seen the cyclone coming. They had tried to warn their husbands, their communities, but no one wanted to listen. So ever since then, we've been working to try and document the impacts of women's localised, women's Indigenous knowledge on climate change. And working with Monash University, we've been able to show and demonstrate from the experiences of women across very different regions, from Kenya, Cambodia to Vanuatu, that women's localised knowledge alongside the science can play a critical role in responding to the impacts of climate change. We also found that it's critical in all countries that we continue our efforts to bring more women's voices and formal representation to the table in discussions around climate change adaptation plans, as well as disaster management. And the third thing we found is just the critical importance of women's networks as a strong area for responding to climate change. They're well connected to communities, they definitely can spread the word quickly, and they're a way that women can share knowledge amongst themselves. So through the Gender Responsive Alternatives to Climate Change program, we've been working with women in these 3 countries to continue to support their knowledge, their leadership, and their networks. And I'd like to leave you with this amazing story of hope of women from these 3 countries who have not only mobilised in their communities, but they've also had an opportunity to influence global decision making.
Cyclones,
droughts,
floodings,
disasters.
It's the climate we are living in.
Women are participating now at decision-making levels whereby they can decide on what to do when disasters hit the area.
Cyclone Bam was a disaster that really affected the whole country of Vanuatu. The roofs were blown off. Our gardens were damaged. There was no food security. We have lost everything.
Climate change has destroyed part of my life. Drought hit the area. We lost our animals. So my father decided to marry me off. It destroyed my life because I never see my dreams.
ជាក់ស្ដែង3ឆ្នាំកន្លងមកនេះអំបិលធ្វើអត់បានព្រោះខែអំបិលត្រូវភ្លៀងធ្លាក់មកធ្វើឲ្យអំបិលផលិតអត់បានធ្វើឲ្យកាត់បន្ថយប្រាក់ចំណូលនៅក្នុងគ្រួសាររបស់ខ្ញុំ
After cyclone, women in my community started to mobilize.
Women at my community organized themselves, and we told the Kenyan government the experiences that women has in the ground.
Before, women were not involved in decision making. But as we come to know about CRAC project, this enables women to stand and to speak for themselves.
When I got to Krong Sanao, I had a ramtak, I had a baby. When I got to Krong Sanao,
I was coming just thinking, I don't know what I will get from this conference. But when I came in here, I was amazed. More effort should be put onto these women, onto these groups, to stand and talk in front of many people. It was really hard, but I'm so proud because I've already empowered other women. And make sure that we make this government accountable. Our voices is being heard at a global level.
Member states of the United Nations in New York will have the opportunity to hear what came out of this platform.
ខ្ញុំបានយកចំណេះដឹងពីស្ត្រីគ្រប់ប្រទេសដែលបានមកចូលរួមវេទិកាសកលហ្នឹងចូលរួមចែករំលែកដូចជាចងក្រងបណ្ដាញស្ត្រីសហគមន៍របស់គាត់និយាយពីសហគមន៍របស់គាត់ដែលពេលមានគ្រោះមហន្តរាយកើតឡើង
When I go back to Vanuatu, to my community, my hope for the future is to promote the women to be leaders in the country and in my community.
ActionAid has helped us build our networks. It has empowered me from where I was until where I am.